Prosecutorial leverage quietly shapes decisions long before defendants ever enter courtrooms.
Court efficiency increasingly depends upon negotiated pleas instead of contested public trials. Daily courthouse routines conceal enormous constitutional pressures operating beneath ordinary administrative procedures. Every folder represents negotiations balancing constitutional rights against institutional procedural convenience. Charging decisions frequently determine outcomes before juries are ever formally assembled. Mandatory sentencing structures transformed bargaining leverage into an ordinary prosecutorial administrative instrument.
Most criminal cases conclude privately through negotiations, rather than transparent courtroom examination.
Public architecture suggests openness, while plea bargaining increasingly relocates justice behind closed doors. Time pressures influence defendants considering whether exercising constitutional rights remains personally survivable.
The Sixth Amendment formally guarantees trials, yet exercising rights often carries measurable punishment. Enhanced sentencing statutes expanded prosecutorial leverage during private plea negotiation discussions. Defendants enter systems where procedural incentives frequently outweigh adversarial constitutional protections.
Overloaded defense systems encourage rapid resolutions instead of exhaustive evidentiary courtroom challenges. Empty jury benches increasingly symbolize constitutional rights exercised only under extraordinary personal risk. Individual defendants confront overwhelming institutional pressure while calculating potentially catastrophic sentencing consequences.
Families absorb procedural decisions whose consequences frequently extend across multiple generations afterward.
Resource limitations constrain defense preparation, while prosecutors maintain substantial institutional negotiating advantages.
Courtroom outcomes influence households long before formal judgments become publicly documented within records.
Criminal prosecutions reverberate beyond defendants, reshaping entire family structures through prolonged uncertainty.
Appearance becomes psychologically important when freedom increasingly depends upon negotiated prosecutorial discretion. Long procedural delays gradually normalize environments where constitutional rights become strategic bargaining variables.
Defendants frequently weigh uncertain trials against guaranteed punishments offered through negotiated pleas.
Sentencing enhancements often redefine negotiations before factual disputes ever reach juror evaluation.
Administrative routines quietly support systems prioritizing rapid case resolution over contested constitutional proceedings.
Anxiety intensifies when exercising trial rights may dramatically increase potential sentencing exposure afterward.
Court proceedings often appear procedural externally, while emotionally destabilizing families internally for decades. Numerical sentencing disparities frequently become central tools encouraging defendants toward negotiated pleas.
Human exhaustion contributes silently to plea bargaining systems dependent upon continuous administrative throughput.
Initial accusations frequently establish leverage, later amplified through enhanced prosecutorial charging decisions. Habitual offender statutes dramatically increased bargaining power available during criminal prosecution negotiations.
Strategic calculations increasingly center upon sentencing exposure instead of evidentiary factual disputes alone. Procedural momentum steadily carries defendants toward negotiated outcomes before formal trial preparation concludes. Prosecutorial discretion operates within cultures emphasizing efficiency, conviction rates, and procedural finality. Early procedural decisions frequently determine negotiating leverage available throughout subsequent criminal litigation processes. Information accumulation gradually strengthens prosecutorial bargaining positions during pretrial negotiation stages.
Independent investigations become difficult when defendants lack substantial financial or institutional resources.
Additional charges frequently emerge after defendants decline negotiated plea agreements offered initially. Legal leverage often derives from sentencing exposure rather than evidentiary certainty regarding underlying allegations. Isolation intensifies perceptions that contesting charges may produce substantially harsher judicial outcomes afterward.
Trials preserve transparent records, yet negotiated pleas increasingly replace public evidentiary scrutiny processes.
Early investigative narratives frequently influence negotiations long before courtroom factual challenges occur publicly.
Negotiation pressure intensifies when potential trial sentences greatly exceed plea agreement recommendations.
Physical evidence receives meticulous analysis, while plea negotiations often avoid comparable public examination entirely. Administrative precision contrasts with negotiation systems relying heavily upon predictive sentencing pressure mechanisms. Interrogation statements frequently become bargaining tools, influencing subsequent plea negotiation strategies and outcomes. Potential punishments increasingly function as negotiation instruments rather than solely post-conviction judicial consequences.
Documented proceedings preserve transparency, absent from many closed-door prosecutorial bargaining conversations occurring privately. Constitutional protections increasingly depend upon precedent interpreting procedural efficiency alongside individual liberties. Evidence development proceeds methodically, while plea negotiations frequently accelerate under substantial institutional pressures. Numerical sentencing disparities frequently determine negotiations more decisively than disputed factual allegations themselves. Preparing comprehensive trials demands resources often unavailable within heavily burdened public defense systems today.
Enhanced charging authority transformed plea bargaining into dominant modern criminal adjudication practice nationwide.
Technical evidence analysis often becomes secondary once overwhelming sentencing leverage enters negotiations privately. Appeals increasingly examine procedural fairness surrounding plea bargaining practices within overloaded judicial systems nationwide. Public courtroom rituals persist despite most criminal adjudications occurring through negotiated agreements privately. Written agreements formalize decisions shaped by immense disparities between plea and trial sentencing outcomes. Courts increasingly balanced procedural efficiency against traditional adversarial constitutional trial protections during modern expansions. Prosecutors argued enhanced charges legitimately encouraged negotiated resolutions, preserving limited judicial resources nationwide. Defense counsel questioned whether coercive sentencing disparities effectively punished exercising protected constitutional trial rights. Public audiences rarely witness negotiations shaping outcomes before formal courtroom proceedings ever formally begin. Precedent gradually normalized prosecutorial pressure tactics previously considered constitutionally troubling by many observers.
Many defendants accepted certainty immediately, rather than risking substantially harsher post-trial sentencing exposure afterward.
Judicial approval frequently formalized agreements, negotiated primarily between prosecutors and defense counsel privately. Constitutional interpretation increasingly emphasized administrative practicality alongside procedural fairness within criminal adjudication systems.
Sentencing enhancements frequently determined bargaining leverage independent from underlying evidentiary factual disputes themselves.
Trial preparation demanded extensive labor despite overwhelming institutional expectations favoring negotiated pleas instead.
Courts confronted tensions between voluntary plea agreements and potentially coercive sentencing differentials nationwide.
Negotiations increasingly replaced adversarial evidentiary contests, traditionally central to constitutional criminal proceedings historically. Legal debates centered upon whether prosecutorial threats undermined meaningful voluntary defendant decision-making processes. Procedural outcomes frequently reflected negotiated pressures more than publicly contested evidentiary factual determinations afterward. The constitutional right to trial increasingly carried severe practical penalties within modern prosecutorial systems. Bordenkircher v. Hayes validated threatening substantially harsher charges during plea bargaining negotiations nationally. Voluntary decisions become difficult when alternatives include dramatically increased sentencing exposure after trial. Symbolic constitutional ideals increasingly conflicted with practical incentives discouraging public criminal trials nationwide.
Critics argued prosecutorial leverage effectively punished defendants asserting protected adversarial procedural rights openly. Administrative efficiency became dependent upon negotiated pleas, resolving overwhelming criminal court caseloads rapidly.
Constitutional jury trials increasingly transformed into rare procedural exceptions instead of standard criminal adjudications. Numerical disparities often communicated consequences more persuasively than abstract constitutional legal principles ever could. Scholars describe substantial sentencing disparities as informal taxation upon exercising constitutional trial rights today. Systemic delays increased institutional incentives favoring negotiated resolutions over resource-intensive public trials nationwide. Charging authority frequently created leverage independent from evidence ultimately presented before juries publicly. Plea bargaining often resolved cases before communities participated through constitutionally protected jury deliberations publicly. Academic debates questioned whether coercive bargaining preserved efficiency while undermining adversarial constitutional legitimacy nationally. Institutional systems continued operating efficiently, while constitutional concerns persisted unresolved across decades afterward. Appeals examined whether plea bargaining pressures remained constitutionally permissible under established judicial precedent nationwide. Higher courts increasingly deferred toward prosecutorial discretion, supporting negotiated criminal case resolutions nationally. Long appellate processes rarely reversed systemic incentives, discouraging defendants from demanding public trials consistently. Negotiated resolutions accumulated historically, while contested jury trials became comparatively uncommon procedural outcomes nationally. Public discussion periodically revisited whether sentencing disparities undermined meaningful constitutional procedural choice protections.
Institutional continuity preserved bargaining practices, despite recurring criticism from legal scholars and defense advocates.
Post-conviction reflection frequently centered upon pressures influencing earlier plea bargaining decisions made privately. Years later, many cases remained remembered primarily through administrative records instead of public testimony. Time gradually obscured individual cases, while systemic plea bargaining practices continued expanding nationally afterward.
Historical analysis increasingly connected mass plea bargaining with broader institutional efficiency demands nationwide.
Experienced attorneys recognized negotiation pressures shaping outcomes beyond factual guilt determinations alone frequently. Many disputed facts never reached public testimony because negotiations resolved cases beforehand privately.
Procedural finality often arrived despite unresolved philosophical concerns regarding coercive bargaining practices nationally.
Decades later, courts still relied heavily upon plea negotiations, sustaining overwhelming institutional caseload management. Contemporary technology accelerated negotiations while underlying constitutional tensions remained largely unchanged across judicial systems. Modern efficiency innovations further distanced defendants from traditional public courtroom procedural experiences nationally.
Emerging legal generations increasingly studied plea bargaining as dominant contemporary criminal adjudication framework nationwide.
Jury participation declined proportionally as negotiated pleas resolved overwhelming percentages of criminal cases nationally.
Veteran jurists acknowledge systemic dependence upon bargaining, despite enduring constitutional discomfort regarding coercive pressures. Statistical disparities consistently demonstrated significantly harsher outcomes following unsuccessful trial proceedings for defendants.
Administrative metrics increasingly measured efficiency through negotiated resolutions rather than contested evidentiary courtroom proceedings.
Technological modernization never resolved fundamental tensions surrounding coercive plea bargaining structures within criminal courts.
Daily maintenance routines continued surrounding institutions, fundamentally shaped by negotiated criminal case resolutions nationwide.
Individual consequences persisted long after procedural negotiations concluded within formal judicial administrative systems afterward.
Ongoing ethical debates questioned boundaries separating negotiation from unconstitutional coercive prosecutorial conduct nationwide. Constitutional symbolism remained visible, while practical procedural incentives increasingly discouraged public criminal trials nationally. The right to trial formally survives, despite institutional structures discouraging its practical exercise today. Efficiency preserved modern courts, while unresolved constitutional questions continued lingering quietly beneath procedural normalcy.